The Church in the Woods. Welcome everyone to AA Castor Book Club. Today's story is The Church in the Woods. Prepare yourselves for a journey into the heart of terror, where faith and survival are put to the ultimate test. Chapter 1. The Lost Man. Thomas awoke with a start, the damp ground cold beneath him and the towering trees casting long shadows in the fading light. He rubbed his eyes, trying to recall how he had ended up in the middle of this dense forest. The last thing he remembered was hiking with his friends, but now he was alone, the silence of the woods pressing in on him. His clothes were wet from the morning dew, and his body ached from sleeping on the uneven forest floor. The sky above was an ominous gray, hinting at an impending storm. Thomas sat up and looked around, trying to get his bearings. The forest was dense, the trees standing like silent sentinels around him. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. He could hear the distant chirping of birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but no sign of human activity. He checked his pockets for his phone, but it was gone. He must have dropped it somewhere along the way. As he stood and dusted himself off, he noticed a faint glow through the trees. A strange mix of relief and curiosity compelled him to move towards the light, hoping to find some semblance of civilization or at least a place to get his bearings. He pushed through the thick underbrush, the branches scratching at his arms and face, and emerged into a small clearing. There, nestled among the ancient oaks and towering pines, was an old, decrepit church, its spires reaching toward the darkening sky. The stone walls were weathered and covered in ivy, and the stained glass windows were cracked and dusty, their once vibrant colors now muted and faded. The sight of the church filled him with a strange sense of familiarity and unease. People were entering the building, but their expressions were cold and distant. Their attire was old-fashioned, reminiscent of a bygone era. Men wore dark, heavy suits and women donned long, somber dresses. Their faces were pale and drawn, as if they had stepped out of a history book. The way they moved was unsettling, almost robotic, their eyes never meeting his. "Hello," Thomas called out, but his voice seemed to vanish into the oppressive silence. No one acknowledged his presence, their eyes averted as they walked past him and through the heavy wooden doors. The door itself was massive, with intricate carvings that seemed to twist and shift in the flickering light. He noticed strange symbols etched into the stone, symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. With a deep breath, Thomas approached the church cautiously, the feeling of being unwelcome growing stronger with each step. He reached out and touched the door, feeling the rough, cold surface beneath his fingers, hesitating for a moment before pushing it open. The inside of the church was dimly lit, the flickering candles casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of incense, mingled with the musty odor of age and neglect. The wooden pews were worn and splintered, and the stone floor was uneven and cracked. Chapter 2. The Unwelcome. As Thomas entered, he was struck by the chill in the air, which seemed to seep into his bones. He walked down the aisle, glancing at the statues that lined the nave. For a brief moment, he thought he saw the twisted, demonic faces of the statues leering at him, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. The stone figures, cloaked in shadow, seemed to writhe and contort, their expressions twisted into grotesque masks of agony. He blinked, and the statues returned to their serene, saintly forms. Shaking his head, he chalked it up to his overactive imagination. The congregation was seated, their faces expressionless as they watched the priest, who stood at the altar. The priest's eyes seemed to pierce through the dim light, his gaze cold and unfeeling. Thomas took a seat at the back, feeling the chill of the wooden pew seep through his clothes. He tried to focus on the sermon, but his mind kept wandering back to the strange symbols he had seen on the door and the eerie feeling that had settled over him. The priest began the service, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. The words were familiar, yet there was something off about them. The Latin phrases seemed twisted, the prayers taking on a sinister tone. Thomas felt a cold breeze sweep through the church, and he shivered. He glanced around, noticing the congregation's eyes were fixed on the priest, their expressions devoid of emotion. The priest's eyes glowed red as he continued the service, the sight sending a shiver down Thomas's spine. He tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, but the unsettling feeling remained. The priest, an imposing figure in his dark robes, moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost unnatural. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the space, but there was an underlying malice that Thomas couldn't ignore. Thomas's attention was drawn to the large crucifix above the altar. The figure of Christ seemed to twist in agony, the eyes almost pleading. He looked away, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt this kind of fear in a church before. The congregation's cold demeanor and the eerie atmosphere made him feel like he was trapped in a nightmare. As Thomas observed the congregation, he noticed their skin was pale and almost translucent. Their eyes, sunken and lifeless, seemed to lack any warmth or humanity. The entire scene felt surreal, as if he had stepped into another world. He could hear the faint murmurs of the congregation as they whispered prayers in a language he couldn't understand. During the sermon, Thomas noticed an old woman sitting near him. Her hands were gnarled and covered in age spots, and her eyes seemed to stare right through him. She leaned over and whispered to him, her voice a raspy hiss. "You shouldn't be here." Thomas leaned closer, trying to hear her better. "What do you mean?" "They don't like strangers," she replied, her voice barely audible. "You need to leave before it's too late." Before Thomas could ask her more, she turned away, her attention back on the priest. He felt a chill run down his spine. The warning had been clear, but he felt trapped. Leaving the church meant going back into the dark, unknown forest. The communion began, and the congregation rose as one, forming a line down the center aisle. Thomas watched as each person approached the priest, who placed a small wafer on their tongues, intoning, "The body of Christ." Chapter 3, The Taste of Flesh. When it was Thomas's turn, he reluctantly joined the line. The air grew colder as he approached the altar, the priest's eyes seeming to bore into his soul. Thomas opened his mouth, and the priest placed the wafer on his tongue. As soon as it touched his taste buds, Thomas recoiled. The wafer was metallic and fleshy, a taste so vile it made him gag. He spat it out, horrified to see a chunk of raw, bloody flesh on the floor. He looked up, his eyes wide with terror, as the entire congregation turned to face him, their eyes empty and lifeless. Frozen with fear, Thomas stared at the bloodied flesh at his feet, his mind racing. What kind of place was this? The congregation's eyes remained fixed on him, their expressions unchanged. The priest's red eyes seemed to glow brighter, and the chill in the air grew more intense. "Is something wrong?" the priest asked, his voice dripping with malice. Thomas struggled to find his voice. What is this?" "The body of Christ," the priest replied, a sinister smile spreading across his face. Panic surged through Thomas, and he bolted for the door. He could hear the congregation rising behind him, their footsteps echoing through the church as they pursued him. He burst through the doors and into the night, the cold air stinging his lungs as he ran. He didn't dare look back, the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows deepening as he ran. Finally, he stopped to catch his breath, expecting to see the congregation hot on his heels. But when he turned, there was no one there. The forest was silent, the church nowhere to be seen. Thomas stood there, panting, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He was alone once more, the eerie silence of the woods pressing in on him. Chapter 4, The Escape. Thomas stumbled through the forest, trying to find his way back to civilization. The taste of blood and flesh lingered in his mouth, a grim reminder of the horror he had witnessed. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made him jump, fearing that the congregation was still following him. The forest seemed to twist and turn, confusing him further as he tried to retrace his steps. He paused to rest by a large oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, but there was something else, a faint metallic tang that reminded him of blood. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he had experienced. How could a church and its congregation vanish without a trace? As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Thomas stumbled upon a narrow path. He followed it, hoping it would lead him to safety. The path wound through the forest, the trees gradually thinning out as he walked. He emerged onto a road, the sight of it filling him with a sense of relief. He flagged down a passing car, the driver looking at him with concern. "Are you all right?" the driver asked, noticing Thomas's disheveled appearance. Thomas tried to explain what had happened, but his words were jumbled, the terror of the night still fresh in his mind. There was a church, and people. They weren't human. They tried to make me eat flesh. The driver's expression shifted from concern to skepticism. "A church? Out here? You must be mistaken. There's nothing like that around these parts." "Please, you have to believe me," Thomas pleaded. "I know what I saw." The driver sighed, but agreed to take him to the nearest town. "All right, let's get you to the police. Maybe they can help you." Chapter 5. The Investigation. At the police station, Thomas recounted his story to the officers. Their expressions ranged from disbelief to mild amusement. The chief of police, a grizzled man named Officer Reynolds, listened patiently before speaking. "Son, are you sure you didn't hit your head out there?" Reynolds asked. "There's no church in those woods. Never has been." "I'm telling the truth," Thomas insisted. "It was real. The people, the priest. They were all there." Reynolds sighed and glanced at his deputy. "All right, we'll humor you. Let's take a look. Maybe we can find some clue as to what happened." They drove back to the forest, Thomas leading them to where he had seen the church. But when they arrived, there was nothing but an empty clearing. The church had vanished, leaving no trace behind. "I swear it was right here," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "It was real." The officers exchanged glances. "We'll file a report," Reynolds said, "but there's not much we can do without evidence." As they walked back to the car, the deputy, a young man named Officer Daniels, pulled Thomas aside. "Hey, I believe you saw something," Daniels whispered. "This place has always given me the creeps. But without proof, there's not much we can do." Thomas nodded, feeling defeated. "Thanks for believing me." Chapter 6. The Aftermath. Back in town, Thomas tried to go about his life, but the memory of the church haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. He spent hours researching the area, trying to find any mention of the church or its congregation. One evening, as he was sifting through old town records in the library, an elderly librarian approached him. "Can I help you with something, young man?" she asked, peering at him over her glasses. Thomas explained what he was looking for, and her eyes widened. "You're talking about St. Athanasius Church," she said quietly. "It was abandoned and torn down over a century ago. People said it was cursed." "Cursed?" Thomas echoed. "What do you mean?" The librarian glanced around nervously before continuing. "They say the priest was involved in dark rituals. The congregation disappeared one night, and the church was found abandoned, with symbols etched into the walls. No one dared go near it after that." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you know where it was located?" The librarian nodded. "In the woods, just outside of town. But it's just a legend now. No one believes it really happened." Chapter 7. The Return. Determined to find answers, Thomas decided to return to the forest. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of purpose, he ventured back into the woods. The path seemed different now, as if the forest itself had shifted to conceal its secrets. After hours of searching, He finally found the clearing where the church had stood. The air was thick with tension, and he felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him. As he stood there, he heard the faint sound of whistling, a haunting melody that sent shivers down his spine. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a thick fog rolled in, obscuring his vision. He heard footsteps behind him and spun around, but there was no one there. The fog grew thicker and the whistling grew louder. "Who's there?" Thomas called out, his voice echoing in the mist. A figure emerged from the fog, its eyes glowing red. It was the priest, his face twisted into a sinister smile. "Welcome back, Thomas," he said, his voice sending a chill through Thomas's body. "We've been waiting for you." Thomas backed away, his heart pounding. "This can't be real," he whispered. "You're not real." The priest laughed, a sound that echoed through the trees. "Oh, but we are very real, and now you will join us." The fog closed in around Thomas, the priest's red eyes the last thing he saw before everything went black. Chapter 8: The Final Escape. Thomas awoke in the church, the familiar scent of incense filling the air. The congregation was seated, their eyes fixed on him. He was bound to a wooden chair in the center of the aisle, his heart racing with fear. The priest stood before him, holding a chalice filled with a dark, thick liquid. "Drink," he commanded, his voice echoing through the church. "No," Thomas pleaded, struggling against his bonds. "Please, let me go." The priest's eyes glowed brighter. "You have no choice. You are one of us now." Desperation gave Thomas a surge of strength, and he managed to break free from the chair. He ran down the aisle, the congregation rising to block his path. But he fought his way through, fueled by a primal need to survive. He burst through the doors and into the night, the fog still thick around him. The whistling followed him, growing louder and more frantic. He ran blindly, the trees closing in around him. Suddenly, he tripped over a root and fell to the ground. The fog parted, revealing a figure standing before him. It was the old woman from the church, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Run," she whispered. "Run and never look back." Thomas scrambled to his feet and ran, the woman's voice echoing in his mind. He didn't stop until he reached the road, his lungs burning and his heart pounding. He flagged down a car, the driver looking at him with concern. "Please help me," Thomas gasped. "Get me out of here." The driver nodded and sped away, leaving the forest behind. Thomas looked back one last time, the fog closing in on the road. The church and its congregation were gone, but the memory of them would haunt him forever. Chapter 9: The Revelation. Thomas moved to a new town, hoping to start fresh. But the memories of the church lingered, haunting his dreams and shadowing his waking hours. He avoided the woods and spent his days trying to forget the horrors he had witnessed. One day, while walking through town, he saw a flyer for a local historian's lecture on the town's history. Intrigued, he decided to attend, hoping to find some closure. The lecture was held in a small community center, and the room was filled with curious townsfolk. The historian, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, began her talk with stories of the town's founding and its early settlers. "Many of you may have heard of the legend of St. Athanasius Church," she said, her voice echoing in the room. "It's a tale that has been passed down through generations, shrouded in mystery and fear." Thomas listened intently as she recounted the story of the church, its cursed congregation, and the dark rituals of the priest. Some believe the church still exists, hidden in the woods, waiting for the unsuspecting to stumble upon it. After the lecture, Thomas approached the historian, his heart pounding. "Excuse me," he said, his voice trembling. "I need to know more about the church. I think I found it." The historian's eyes widened. "You saw it? Tell me everything." Thomas recounted his experience, the historian listening with rapt attention. When he finished, she nodded slowly. "You are not the first to have seen the church. Others have reported similar encounters, but none have been as detailed as yours. Why does it exist? Thomas asked. What does it want? The historian sighed. Some believe it is a remnant of a dark past, a place where evil was allowed to flourish. The church and its congregation are trapped in a time loop, repeating their dark rituals and seeking new victims to join them. Thomas shuddered. Is there any way to stop it? The historian shook her head. No one knows for sure, but one thing is certain, you must stay away from those woods. The church will always be there, waiting. Chapter 10. The Resolution. Thomas took the historian's advice to heart. He moved again, this time to a bustling city far from any woods. He tried to rebuild his life, but the memories of the church were always with him, a dark shadow lurking in the corners of his mind. He sought therapy, hoping to find peace. His therapist, a kind and patient woman, helped him work through his trauma. You are safe now, she assured him. The church can't hurt you anymore. But Thomas knew the truth. The church was still out there, hidden in the woods, waiting for its next victim. He could never forget the red eyes of the priest, the taste of flesh, and the haunting whistling. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard a faint sound outside his window. It was the whistling, growing louder and more insistent. He sat up, his heart pounding. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, echoing through the streets. He ran to the window and looked out, but there was nothing there. The whistling grew louder, filling his mind with terror. He knew what it meant. The church had found him. Desperate, Thomas grabbed his keys and ran out of his apartment. He drove aimlessly, the whistling following him. He couldn't escape it. It was inside him, a part of him now. As he drove, he saw the fog rolling in, thick and suffocating. The whistling grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. He knew he couldn't outrun it. The church would always find him. In a final act of desperation, Thomas drove to the nearest bridge. He parked his car and climbed to the edge, the whistling echoing in his mind. He looked down at the dark water below, his heart filled with fear and resignation. I'm sorry, he whispered, closing his eyes. I can't do this anymore. With that, he jumped, the cold water enveloping him, silencing the whistling forever. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed the story and would like to hear more, please share this podcast with your friends and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to visit my website at www.tonyc.info for more content, updates, and exclusive behind-the-scenes insights. This podcast is mainly supported by listeners like you. If you want to help keep the stories coming, consider supporting me on Patreon at www.patreon.com/JTAC. Even just $1 a month makes a huge difference and helps me continue to create the content you love. Thank you again for listening. Your support means the world to me. Until next time, stay safe and keep exploring the unknown.